Hi, my name's Rich Poyat. I'm a scientist emeritus with the U.S. Forest Service. I'm an urban ecologist by training. I also have a lot of soil science in my background, and I'm here to talk to you about urban soil and microforests as part of your coursework. I have a general outline here because I'm going to be talking a little bit more than just about soils. I'm going to begin with the importance of urban landscapes in general, and put this within the context of urban ecosystem services. And you're going to find out that soil is a very important component of that. We're going to talk a little bit about the importance of forest patches, remnants, and microforests. These are terms that are used interchangeably, and depending on where you are in the world. I call them forest patches, but the idea of a microforest or a remnant forest also fits into that. I'm going to spend a significant amount of time and actually show you some data on urban soil characteristics and their importance. And I do want to give you one caveat. Most of the work I've done has been in North America. I've done a lot of work in Europe as well. And so most of my examples are going to come from that. And then I'm going to end with some rules of thumb that I hope you all can use in your careers in the future. So let's start with the importance of urban landscapes. And I always start any urban talk with this because we humans, Homo sapiens, are largely an urban species. I think the UN predicts around 70% of the population, world population, will be urban, classified as urban by 2050. And so because of that, Stormer and Crutzen have come up with the geologic age Anthropocene for when humans really started to dominate and build cities and things like that in the landscape. So what is the ecological environmental significance of this urban landscape that we're creating globally? And 45%, and it's probably higher than this now because these numbers were for 2008. 45% of the net primary productivity occurs in cultivated and densely populated biomes. So probably we're beyond a half of that. So that's significant. Greater than 50% of the reactive nitrogen, and reactive nitrogen is the nitrogen that's kind of loose in the biosphere. So plants can take it up. It can taken up by microorganisms and so on. Fun. Greater than 50% of that reactive nitrogen was fixed by humans, and that was done through the formation of fertilizer and use of fertilizer. So can we come up with an ecological definition of urban? These urban areas obviously are having potentially a huge impact. And I like to use the one, it's where population densities get to a point that are unsupportable by local resources. So you can't just grow the food where you are and just feed everybody that's there. You have to bring in resources from somewhere else. And so how does this then relate to sustainability? And so this is a great paper by Newman in 1999, looking at the city of Sydney in Australia. And he was able to get some measures of these different things. And so we obviously have these inputs that have to be brought into the city because we're beyond that population density that I just talked about. And we're talking about fossil fuels, food, timber products, you name it. But what's really interesting is, we're also producing a lot of waste, and this waste goes somewhere downstream. And so ecologists like to think of this as an ecological footprint. The amount of area that a city needs to bring in, make its food, for example, and then the amount of area that the city's waste systems are impacting outside the city. And we call that the ecological footprint. And because of this, people have really started saying bad things about cities. And I get a little upset about that. And I'll show you why in a little bit. But the question is, are cities bad? And I suggest no, they are part of the solution, not the solution, but they are part of the solution. And I'll show you why. Oh, and And they're part of the solution because if we look at it on a per capita basis, and I'll show you some data. That's my mom. She grew up in New York City. She had 5 sisters. My grandparents and none of the sisters ever learned how to drive. That's a true story. Um, and it's because in New York City, you don't need a car. So on a per capita basis, their emissions are kind of low. And so we can look at the data, carbon emissions per capita on the left-hand side, and then persons per acre of developed land. So the population density on the bottom axis. And so you can see as population densities go up, the per capita emissions go down. So that's good, right? But how do you get it down? We'll get to that in a little bit. So these are just some cities that fall along these transport emissions on the left side, and along the bottom is population density. And you can see that the more dense cities have way fewer emissions per capita. So this is just an example of why cities are needed, because we have to be able to pack people together, but we have to be able to do that sustainably if we're going to get out of this environmental predicament that we're in. So we really want to bring these down, right? And I'm going to talk about other ways we can do this as well. So, but there is a trade-off, obviously, when you pack people together. And I already talked about the ecological footprint. So we have that downstream, upstream. But there's lots of local impacts. This is a Western town in the United States without any infrastructure. It's a muddy mess, because there's a lot of people there, a lot of horses coming through at that time, and so on and so forth. And then we have to think about the recovery of these systems as well. So there's a lot of pollution sources. We have fragmented habitats, built structures, and impervious surfaces. There's lots of soil disturbances out there and compaction going on. We disrupt the nutrient and water cycles, and there's a loss of biodiversity. And you're going to see that soils are an important part of that biodiversity equation. So this is all bad stuff, right? And so humans have come up with this idea of gray infrastructure. The Romans did this way back when. Their engineers developed infrastructure so that they can build what they called sanitary cities. So you bring in fresh water from outside the city and you deal with the cloaca maxima. It was basically their sewer. And they were able to get the sewage off the site into the river, but off to where the people were living, so less disease, and to create these sanitary cities. And on the right-hand side is New York City, same kind of concept. They had aqueducts coming down from reservoirs and so on and so forth. So basically, the engineers, they're way ahead of us. They've been thinking about this for thousands of years, and they've been doing this for thousands of years. However, gray infrastructure and sustainability has its downside. And it's imperfect, it degrades. So this is an example of, infrastructure degrading in the city of Baltimore. And it requires an intense use of resources, lots of capital, it's very costly, and lots of emissions to produce the cement and the asphalt and things like that. So huge downside there. And also there's side effects. And so this is a graph of flow rate over time in an urban watershed versus a forested watershed. And this is after a rainfall event. So that blue line is the flow coming through the system right after a rainfall event. And you can see that it's way up there because the water has nowhere to go but off the impervious surface into the stream. In a forested system, that rain has a place to go into the soil. So you don't have that big hydrograph. And that big flow of water going downstream from an urban area causes floods. It does a lot of ecological damages as well. So really, there's a lot of side effects involved with this infrastructure. So we kind of want to get away from gray infrastructure as much as we can. We're never going to totally get rid of it, but we need to get rid of it as much as we can. And how do we do that? We could do that with ecosystem services. So we go from a sustainable to a sanitary to a sustainable city. So I'm using words here, but going from sanitary city, which is more of an gray infrastructure engineering thing, to sustainable cities, which utilizes gray, brown, and green infrastructure. And we can develop these working ecosystems. For example, on the left, we have eco-engineered ecosystems. These are things that are designed and we can actually engineer them so that they can take a lot of water, for example, and purify that water before it goes into the ground. And we have amenity and remnant ecosystems, which I think these microforests kind of cover all three of these things, depending on how they've been developed and how they're managed. And so what supports everything? The soil. Soil is the foundation for all of these ecosystem services. And so I just want to give you an example of how important these things can be. I don't know if anybody has heard of Victory Gardens in both World Wars. The United States had this Victory Garden movement. I call small plot agriculture. And they were used in the home front to help prevent food shortages during the war. It helped people stretch the food ration coupons because they couldn't go out and buy a lot of stuff because the food was being sent to the soldiers. And at its peak, I think it was 1945, more than 20 million Victory Gardens were found in the United States, primarily in urban areas. And it produced 40% of all the vegetables grown in the United States at that time. Incredible impact. And so it begs the question, how about microforests? How much can we utilize microforests in the same way as we did those Victory Gardens to get these ecosystem services? Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So going back to the Northeastern United States, where I'm familiar with, this is work by a colleague of mine, Vince D'Amico from the U.S. Forest Service, where they looked at air photos and remotely sensed data, and they were able to map forest patches, and you could utilize at various sizes. And what we see here on this graph, size in hectares is on the bottom, that the biggest bar that you could see there is a 1 to 5 hectare size forest. So there's 75,000 of those in this area between Boston and Washington, D.C. in the United States. That's incredible. Only 2% of them are larger. So we're dealing with a highly fragmented system, and the majority of which are the smaller, you can even call them microforests as well. And so just to give you some data on how important they can be, this is a paper by Phillips et al. This is work that was done in Baltimore. Again, I've done a lot of research in Baltimore. A couple of folks there I know, and as those co-authors. And they looked at the capacity of these forest patches to infiltrate stormwater. And you remember I showed you that hydrograph. If you don't have water going into the soil, it's running off into the creeks and causing all kinds of trouble. So you want the water to go in the ground. And so they found that 68% of the historic rainfall in Baltimore was able to be infiltrated by these urban forest patches. And they conservatively estimated that unsaturated urban forest patch soils alone are capable of infiltrating most rain events of low to moderate intensities. That's huge. That's really huge.